when I say, has anyone done any management training, any leadership training, anything? Hands are down. You'll find 1 in 10, if you are lucky. That's extraordinary. Given the size of projects, the budgets, the numbers of people, we seem to have a thing in our industry where people are put in these positions and we hope that they'll survive. We hope that it won't go wrong. We are really well trained to do is to manage processes. What should happen, when it should happen. Let's forget, that there are people who will be pressing those buttons or staying up and doing those drawings or whatever it is. We just know that these things need to happen in a particular order. But that's not the same thing as leadership. And if that leadership style is an inclusive style, game changer for our industry. My full-time thing is this: I don't really have capacity for anything else. However, if someone else says, I think we should do this, I can support them. But those people who sit slightly outside but have the understanding, there is more agility. Perhaps you can push a little bit harder in some ways. You can say things and do things that create change or present challenge. And it's very, very different from being in practice. When you're in practice, for a certain extent, you're an employee. If I say something, how might this impact me? But there are those change makers who are sitting within practice who are like, how can I nudge things? How can I push things? And even if it's going to take 10 years, I'm going to keep trying. But yeah, you need those people, I think, who sit outside but understand it and can dedicate more time to it to really make those sort of structural and systemic changes. In construction, I'd hear things like, oh, you don't see many Black women doing this. Or actually, yes, there was a woman once years ago who we had, but they weren't very good. And you were kind of like, now I feel like I'm carrying the expectations of my gender, my ethnicity, my background, my ancestry. That is way too much. Most people get to go to work and do their job. So I think this whole sort of discussion about diversity and inclusion being important in terms of being an agent to support productivity is absolutely spot on, because you're constantly having to deal with all of this other stuff on top of your job. If you are seen as other, if you are seen as less than.
Welcome to the Courageous Leadership Podcast. I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Danna Walker, an award-winning electrician-turned-architect and the founder and CEO of Built by Us, a social enterprise based in London that's on a mission to transform who gets to build our cities. After starting her career as a young apprentice on construction sites, Danna went on to qualify as an architect, lead equality and inclusion work at the RIBA and the Architects Registration Board, and now runs Built by Us, a not-for-profit consultancy that connects untapped talent into meaningful careers in the built environment, while helping businesses build more inclusive, high-performing teams. I loved how open this conversation was on what needs to change in our industry. You'll be inspired to create support networks in your field of expertise after listening to Danna's passion for what's fair and just. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So, Danna, we are going to do a deep dive into your very interesting career, and I can't wait to do that. You are clearly a formidable leader in the built environment, and I'm so honored that we can finally have this conversation. But I'd like to start with the fact that 10 years ago, you founded Built by Us. And I'd love to take you back to that moment 10 years ago where you decided to take that leap of faith and set up something on your own with a big mission. But take us back to that mission and let us know if something has changed along the way.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. I think these kinds of conversations are so important. And I think I guess the inspiration behind starting Built by Us to a certain extent was my own experience in the built environment. But by that stage, because I'd already been working in the built environment since the age of 16, I collected so many stories and sort of reflected on my experiences, the experiences of others, I'd been already working with other groups who were seeing very similar challenges to myself. And so Built by Us was really kind of like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? We're all kind of aware that there are some significant challenges for our industry in terms of its culture, in terms of the levels of diversity and inclusion, in terms of the levels of respect, payment, everything you could think of. There were instances within our industry, and far too many to ignore or to say, oh, that's just a few bad apples. There were just far too many to kind of say this isn't part of something bigger in terms of there is a pattern here. Having worked on the trade side, worked as an architect, then joined a pan-professional organisation, the Construction Industry Council. So that's all the professions together, working together. I could see that there were the kind of seeds of, people saying, well, I think we can do something about it, but it either wasn't the right time or either too busy or not busy enough. This is central, but it's something we can pick up and drop again. What I wanted to do with Built by Us is to create something that felt sustainable and felt holistic and that would keep its eye on the prize in terms of the mission. So our mission is really about driving greater diversity and inclusion. Our vision is a world built for all by all, which is why Built by Us is the name of the organisation. So that felt right to have that name, that way of describing what it is that we're doing. But 10 years ago, this all, I can remember telling people about it, and they were like, I'm not sure if that's a thing. As is that an organisation? Surely that's a project that you do in your spare time. But for me, that was part of the issue, that it was often, in your own time, something that feels more like a hobby or a social event or something like that. It's not that. It's absolutely fundamental to leadership. It's fundamental to how we work as a sector, how we work within our businesses, how we work within our organizations.
So you could see a gap, and you'd experienced so many of these issues of lack of
Mhm.
inclusion and certainly exclusion. You'd
Yeah.
experienced that firsthand. You could see the gap, but it
Mhm.
wasn't a conversation point 10 years ago. It wasn't one of those things that companies are thinking, oh gosh, we've got to have some answers for this now. But 10 years ago, that was not a conversation point, but you'd experienced it firsthand. You could see the gap and you went in anyway and thought this is important. It's too important to miss, and I will shape something. I will just discover it as I go.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a really good way to put it. I consider myself a student of the subject. I don't think there are truly any gurus. Um, there's so much to kind of discover and unpeel, which, for someone who is quite naturally curious, it's a great place for me to be. Of course, I would like to make, what I do completely defunct. At some point, there should be no need for me or an organization like the one that I've set up. And many people have set up similar organizations that are either talking about this from a single sort of issue or social identity perspective. But yeah, I think that's a great way of summing it up. 10 years ago, this was a conversation that people were having but were hesitant to have. People spoke to me about this subject a lot, but said, I'm kind of fearful of bringing this up. I'm not sure how this is going to affect my reputation. I'm not sure if people want to hire me if I'm seen as the person who's bringing up diversity and inclusion. That is already a pretty big red flag, right? We can't talk about it. We don't feel comfortable talking about it. We'll only talk about it a little bit in a small way. And we already had the Equality Act in place. So all of this stuff that had been talked about actually for decades, for hundreds of years in some cases, it still felt like a kind of a taboo subject for our sector. And I think that's the thing that really made me think something's not quite right here. Speaking to people who work in other sectors, they were like, well, we've been doing this for years. I'm really quite surprised and shocked that some of the things that you're talking about are still happening in your sector, where in other sectors they are not. So, for me, this is a sector I love. I loved I'm working in it. I'm still one of those bores that goes past buildings and go, I worked on that and I worked on this project. And yeah, you told us. It's such an exciting area to be in, but it's too important for such a narrow kind of bandwidth of people, experience, and perspectives to be in. That's the thing that I was curious about wanting to change, and could see that the way that the industry was working was not going to produce that change.
So now talk us about the fact that you came into the architecture industry via trade and via an
Mhm.
apprenticeship. So, and this is clearly something that is now really in the debate, which is brilliant, finally.
I know.
But so talk us through your experience of that, because it wasn't a natural progression, was it? It wasn't just you fell into it. Yes, please talk us
No,
through that.
yeah, and I think it's such an interesting one because I think in the UK, particularly, we also have this thing which is about class. And class is the thing, your sort of socioeconomic background is going to be, to a certain extent, still one of the deciding factors in terms of where you kind of land in terms of your career. So certainly at school, we weren't encouraged to think about the professions as a place to go. In my personal experience, we didn't have a lot of money growing up. I went to a comprehensive school. So I remember a lot of our career stuff was like, let's set up the school foyer like a job centre. And I remember looking at the jobs board, and the highest paid job was dispatch rider. And there were no professional jobs on that jobs board. And I thought, interesting. So even at that age, maybe 15, I was thinking it feels like there's an expectation that we're going to be doing a very particular range of jobs. So I remember speaking to our careers advisor, and I said, I think I want to go to art school. I think I want to do design. I'm not quite sure. And they were like, no, don't do that. There'll be lots of other people way better than you. The best that you can hope for is maybe get a job in a bank, like in a retail kind of scenario. And I had never shown any interest in banking or maths. My grades on English, drama, and art were, amongst the highest. And I was just kind of left that, and I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know anybody who worked in the professions. So it kind of felt like, it's almost like a conveyor belt, you know. Um, so then I thought, right, I want to earn some money. I think if I learn a trade, I'll be okay for the rest of my life. So I went for electrician. While I was an electrician, then of course I started interacting with architects, and I still had that thing of being interested in design, interested in art, and then thought, you know what, I think you can do this. And as if by, I don't know, some people believe in kind of fate, but I remember opening up the South London Press, and there was an ad saying, are you interested in architecture? Are you a woman? We have a 1 year course to introduce you. So it's like a taster, a foundational course. And I have to thank the amazing Marina Adams. I think there was a sister course also at what was then North London, which is now Business Guildhall, Metropolitan something. But yeah, that was what really got me started on the path into architecture. And I think that, Marina stands as someone who was really thinking about how can we bring people who are not already on that particular pathway into the industry? How can we, discover people who would be, amazing, talented, interested, curious. And it's not just about what school you went to or, how much money you had.
And I love the fact that, I mean, what if you hadn't have seen that ad, like that, I guess that tiny little moment where you either saw it or you didn't, but at the same time, you had your
Mm.
eyes peeled for something like this. So you were
Yeah.
more likely to see it than somebody who's just not even open to that concept.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you have to have something in your mind saying, let me just keep my eyes open. Maybe something will happen. But I remember that as a kind of jaw-dropping moment, being in my bedroom thinking, I have no idea how I would even get across the pathways. And even now, the pathways between trade or practical into design or consultancy aren't necessarily as clear. It's what I felt was I had to start again. But once people discovered that I'd worked in the trade, they were like, oh gosh, this is going to be so useful as an architect. You've worked on site, you have that understanding of how things come together, you've installed things. I would love to see that being taken more into consideration in terms of creating those pathways between trade and craft or artisan roles into design and vice versa. Yeah.
So, and I can imagine that being on site, I mean, this is where you see your craft, and this is where you can see something for your efforts. But I can
Yeah.
also imagine that that was quite an isolating experience because other people on site didn't necessarily look and sound like you, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I talk about this quite a lot, some of the things that happened, and it wasn't every single person, but it was certainly enough people to let you get the message loudly and clearly that you were not seen as someone who could make a career along this pathway. And everything from who I am in terms of my ethnicity, my gender was kind of brought to bear. So in the very early sort of first couple of months, the first joke, I needed steel toe cap boots, and they were put on order for me, and they turned up, and everybody who worked in the depot was gathered round, and I thought this is very odd. And the manager at the time, the team manager, said, "Oh, we got your boots," and he was kind of smirking. And oh no, this isn't right. And I opened up the box, and there were these high-heeled steel toe cap shoes in there, and everyone's falling about laughing. And I'm like, right, okay, this is like within the first month. Um, there was a lot of kind of, well, we don't think you're going to last. You'll probably get pregnant anyway, and that kind of thing. Someone else should have had this job. You shouldn't have this job. So all of that, the constant kind of commentary, the constant kind of othering was very much part of the experience. It took a while, actually, maybe a couple of years before they really took me seriously. Um, but at the same time, there were one or two individuals who could kind of see that, what I was going through and would take you to the side and go, don't listen to them. Just keep going. I can see you really want to do this. But that just kind of informed this desire to set up something like Built by Us, to have the thing there that I didn't have. Because it was incredibly isolating, day after day, moment after moment, when you're experiencing microaggressions as well as quite direct and blatant aggression and discrimination. When you're having, doors closed in your face. I was doing a lot of repair and maintenance. I'd visit people's homes, and they'd open the door. I'm an electrician, and some of them would close the door, and then call back to the office saying, "How dare you send this woman?" All that kind of stuff. So. But it made me determined to finish it. I'm gonna finish this. Absolutely. I am gonna qualify. I am gonna do this. I know I can do this. So um, for me, I suppose it kind of helped me really focus on what it is that I wanted to do, and to have that kind of achievement under my belt. But I know there were lots of people who were taken on um, as plumbers and gas fitters and carpenters, lots of women, and they couldn't deal with it. It was just so difficult. It was just so harsh. And I don't blame them for sort of feeling like actually there might be other ways that I can learn money.
Yes, I mean, I can see that. I mean, that's your sense of character, that you had a bigger mission. There was something bigger driving what you were doing day to day. But at the same time, there were at least a couple of people there who could pull you aside, and you knew if it push came to shove, they would have your back. I'm supposing there that,
Yes.
at least, they would back you up. Whereas potentially in some other situations, those people just didn't feel like they had anyone on their side.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And, we try to bring our best selves, to work. But when you're giving certain groups of people an extra load to carry, I haven't just got to think about what it is that I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to mend or how I, complete this task or this role. I've also got the weight of everything else that I'm carrying. Maybe I feel like I'm representing, other groups. So in construction, I'd hear things like, oh, you don't see many black women doing this. Um, or actually, yes, there was a woman once years ago who we had, but they weren't very good. And you were kind of like, now I feel like I'm carrying the expectations of my gender, my ethnicity, my background, my ancestry. Um, that is way too much. Most people get to go to work and do their job, and they might have things like, a person they don't get along with, a lack of resources, a computer that doesn't work, those sorts of things. But then there's this other load. So I think this whole sort of discussion about, you know, diversity being and inclusion being important in terms of being an agent to support productivity is absolutely spot on, because you're constantly having to deal with all of this other stuff on top of your job. If you are seen as other, if you are seen as less than.
So then you break free from the trade workplace
Yeah.
situation and you get to study architecture. And
Mm.
now what are you seeing, and what is your mission now shaping into?
Well, that's really interesting. So, I mentioned earlier that we didn't have a lot of money. So, social housing was part of my experience growing up and the experience of a lot of people around me. And as an electrician, doing lots of repair and maintenance, I was often working within social housing, community centres, that kind of thing. And just looking at buildings, looking at materials and going, why? Why do these buildings look as they do? Why do we see more concrete? Why do we see more medium and high rise? I had no idea about the kind of language of architecture, but that's what it felt like to me, that I was, exposed to a language where I couldn't get the translation, but I knew it was different. I knew that, um, certain areas of London, affluent areas of London, had a different materiality, a different sense of place, had more amenity. um, what I experienced was so interesting. So I go from this very working class, very male kind of situation, and I arrive in architecture, and suddenly I'm told I have an accent, and I'm like, I have an accent? They were like, yeah, the way you say print R. My accent has softened a bit over the years. But I'm like, oh, okay. And I really wanted to work in the areas of housing and regeneration. And there not being many black female architects, so I'd often turn up and people would assume I was the housing officer or a resident. So that was so it was so interesting suddenly being in a culture with different expectations, but with very similar um, kinds of issues around the way people are stereotyped or put into boxes and that kind of thing. One thing I explored and loved about architecture was that sense of, I suppose, creativity, that sense of being able to push boundaries, to have conversations um, that felt so unique, so different for me, and really feeling like, oh, this is the place where people are making these huge decisions. What a neighborhood might look like, how a city might change its identity, how someone's home might support them or not. That was tremendously exciting to me too. So yeah, I look at it from both things, the kind of me in that situation, if you like, as well as what we do in terms of what we create, how we impact people.
Now that you've finished studying and you're
Huh.
looking for work and you know that your passion now is really in housing and regeneration, I suppose, but whether you can dictate that that's where you're going to work, I'm not sure. But where did you
Yeah.
initially start, realizing what it is that you've just learned in practice?
I think it was I was pretty naive actually. I kind
We
of
all are, aren't we?
yeah, oh, quite naive. I thought, well, I've got, these qualifications. I guess I can apply to organizations that I think are really interesting. So I just kind of look and find out as much as I could about different practice. Oh, they do a bit of housing. They're really interested in sustainability. They seem to have some sort of interest in social impact. So that was the thing that really kind of attracted me. But I think that's also partly because of my perspective and experience, having grown up in social housing, having also grown up not having secured housing, squatting when you were allowed to do such things back in the day. As a kid, we were doing things like because we didn't have somewhere to stay. So I think that generally sort of informed that desire to, well, if I'm going to do something, I'd really like to have that impact in the places that I recognize because I see what those limitations can be. I see what those challenges can be. And so I think it did have an effect, an impact on the kind of architecture and built environment work that I wanted to take on. Absolutely. Um, and it was so interesting to me because everybody that I was studying with also had their own vision. Some were like, no, it's art galleries, it's international projects. And I'm like, no. So I can remember people thinking it was slightly odd that I kept saying, I want to do housing, I want to do regenerate, I want to do that kind of work. Regeneration, I think more recently, the terminology is challenged a lot more because often people link it very much to gentrification. But at that time, it did seem like what we are trying to do is make a better world, but also for people that don't have a lot of choices, don't necessarily have huge amounts of money. That's what I was passionate about. Yeah.
And so did those early days of stepping out into practice live
Mm.
up to your expectations or maybe not?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes and no. I think the first thing was that naivety meant that I had no idea how things worked. I was just kind of speculatively, putting applications and hoping someone would come back to me. And then you were met with a wall of silence and go, "Oh, am I doing something wrong?" That kind of thing. Um, I then started to realize how important it was that, those networks that you create as a student, et cetera, et cetera. So that helped me tremendously. And actually, the first job that I got, it was through application, but someone said, "Oh, my place is looking for someone. This is the kind of work that we do." And it was, a lot of the kind of work that I was interested in. So yeah, I feel like there's always a degree of luck. And I think, as you said earlier, when you're already kind of thinking about it, somehow you're keeping your eyes peeled and you're talking about that so people may well respond positively and help you and support you in achieving that dream.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it? Because when you're studying and you're in this bubble, if you like, and it
Mm.
feels like the work is so intense and, you're doing all these all-nighters and all of these
Mm.
things because the work just feels so intense and you're in this bubble. But then
Yeah.
when you step out of the bubble and you realize, but actually, I haven't learned really half of the things I actually need to actually use in practice. So really
Yeah.
now the learning does begin. And I guess I've learned how to learn, but now I actually learn what I need. And
Yeah.
I certainly felt like that. But then you need those people in practice who remember what it's like to come in and be naive, like bounds of energy, but naive with how to
Yeah.
use it. So
Exactly.
tapping into that energy, if you like, but also helping to channel it. So you do
Mm.
need those people in the early days of coming into practice, don't you, to make that transition from
Mhm.
studying to the real world.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody really explains what that journey is going to be like. We set it out in this way, which makes it sound like, yeah, you just do your part one, your part two, and your part three, architect. Ta-da! But actually, what happens is far more interesting, far more sort of fundamental in terms of building up that sort of understanding of built environment, but also people in terms of how you bring together those sort of ideas. At uni, we're often talking about concepts and theories and ideas and what, the architects may have brought to the table in terms of different ways of viewing um, architecture. And then you're in practice, and suddenly it's quite a different conversation because now you've got real people with real deadlines. Um, and some of the things that you've learned, you kind of need to throw away. And some of them you go, oh, thank goodness, we had those conversations because now I know how to embrace that or how to make that idea tangible. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really thankful to architectural education for. making something tangible, that kind of critical thinking, bringing ideas to the fore. But yeah, it's fair to say it's a massive culture shock going from being a student into practice, then from, early stage practice into you're the architect, you're the person that's leading, you're the person that's making, the bigger decisions. That in and of itself is a huge challenge. So um, I'm kind of thankful, I think, for being able to take that journey and get into practice. But it also made me realize, if I want to affect change, maybe being in practice isn't the way to do it. My intention actually was to step away for a little bit and go back. But once I stepped away, I just thought, oh my goodness, there are all these other things that I can get involved in. And hence, yeah, somehow coming around to starting Built by Us.
And so that moment when you realized I can't influence the way I want to influence by sitting inside this practice, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I move to another practice, I would have any more capacity. So this
Um,
realization that you want to influence, like not everybody has that. Like there's a
mm,
seed of something, and I can hear there's a pattern that's been from very young in your life when you
mm,
see something and you resist it and that's not acceptable and that's not good enough. I will
mm,
find a way to make that better. Not everybody has that kind of nugget in them, but it clearly
mm,
you do. But also because you've listened to that voice before to say, look, this isn't right, there's a better way, you
yeah.
again listen to it and say, but I now need to move somewhere where I can influence.
Yeah, that's really kind of you to say that, because I kind of think that there are lots of people who come into architecture that do have an idea like that, but once you see how it works, you kind of go, this might not be the place to do it, or maybe I can do it through setting up my own practice or going into teaching. So I think there are people who, or going into writing, who kind of either have a parallel thing that they're doing, or they make a change in direction. I think having already made a change in direction, it didn't seem completely alien to me that that's something that I could do. But I also realize you need people in all the different spaces. So you need people actually within industry who go, my full-time thing is this. I don't really have capacity for anything else. However, if someone else says, I think we should do this, I can support them. But those people who sit slightly outside but have the understanding, going back to those, when I first said, I think I want to set up Built by Us, and people who were very kind and well-meaning said, don't do it, you might wreck your career. I think what that also speaks to is if you're sitting slightly outside of it, there is more agility. Perhaps you can push a little bit harder in some ways. You can say things and do things that create change or present challenge. And it's very, very different from being in practice. When you're in practice, for a certain extent, you're an employee. And for many people, that will be the first thing that's in their mind. If I say something, how might this impact me? So I totally get it. But there are those change makers who are sitting within practice who are like, how can I nudge things? How can I push things? And even if it's going to take 10 years, I'm going to keep trying. Um, but yeah, you need those people, I think, who sit outside but understand it, and can dedicate more time to it, to really make those sort of structural and systemic changes.
And so now with this knowledge of, you've made some major pivots in your career, you've
Mm,
understood some of the challenges, you've seen
mm,
where some of this energy could go if it's put in the
mm,
right direction and it's supported. So
mhm,
now you've set up Built by Us and
mhm.
you've got a number of programs that you do and you're targeting obviously certain individuals. So just talk us through what was the foundation work that you began
Mm.
with and what you're currently doing.
So interesting. So I guess what it really started with was all of those individuals who were saying very similar things to the things I've thought or said over the years, to the reports that had come out that were kind of highlighting that there were challenges for people who might be returning to work after a career break, having children, um, to the differences in compensation based on gender, all of these different things. So it started with the mentoring. How can I set something out at scale, which is going to support individuals who are maybe contemplating leaving industry, maybe contemplating giving up their studies, that kind of thing, because they're finding it so difficult to navigate. So the one series of the programs is really about that kind of individual and capacity building element. The other plank I would say is the advocacy. So keeping that conversation going, making sure it's nuanced enough that it really is dealing not only with the surface level stuff, but going a bit deeper in terms of what those challenges are and the ways in which we can meet them. And then the third thing is actually working with organizations. So I think there are organizations who say, yeah, that all sounds lovely. Number one, we don't have the time. Number two, we're not even sure where to start because there's so many things that are being brought up here. So, I really feel that it's important that people have that support. Making change is difficult. It doesn't matter whether it's an individual thing. I'd like to, be able to speak French by next year, or I'd like to, run the marathon, whatever. If you can get a coach, if you can get, that sense of support, there are a number of different things that you will need. Can Built by Us be that? So, those three pillars I felt were quite central to what we do. And yes, of course, over the past 10 years, so much has changed. So we went into a period where there was this kind of real interest and demand, I think, in terms of people wanting to learn, people wanting to challenge. COVID changed the game in terms of talking about flexible working. I remember just before COVID, that was the plan. We're going to do a big campaign about flexible working because there isn't enough of it. Then COVID happened and it totally changed the conversation. Is it fixed? No. But suddenly it is an entirely different conversation. Certainly the tragedy around George Floyd meant that people were having very different and much more real conversations about equity, about race, about racism, about the ways that has impacted and continues to impact individuals' experiences, whether they're at work, at home, in their neighborhoods, on their streets. Now we're in a kind of political climate which for me, I always thought it was possible, but man, to think that we have, in the United States and in other countries around the world, leaders who are using the same old kind of divide and rule tricks and using social identity and weaponizing that, but also linking that to the ways in which businesses operate or people operate and vote and all of that kind of stuff. It's just horrific. So, every time I think, oh, this is probably a role that I'm not going to be doing for much longer, something shifts and you're like,
It's
not only
needed
is it
now
more
more
needed,
than ever, isn't it?
more
Yeah.
than ever, but also we constantly have to be thinking about how we adapt in these moments, because the people who do not want to see inclusion, diversity, they're adapting, they're changing, they're using different sort of routes, delivery vehicles, all the rest of it. So yeah, it's absolutely essential. Anybody working in these areas are constantly thinking about, the way that things change, how quickly they can change, but also how we can adapt to address that.
And just on that point of
Yeah.
adaptation, because I think that it becomes like diversity just becomes like that catch-all phrase that really,
Mm,
and then it's so diluted and not impactful and can then be brushed under the carpet. So
yeah.
I'm wondering whether you found ways, or there's some things, there's some messaging, or there's some points where you understand that to a business, that's the kind of
Mm,
language, that's what they understand, and that's how they will consider it a value proposition to
mm,
pursue,
mm.
versus speaking to individuals or speaking to leaders. I mean, I'm just interested in how you, speaking of those nuances,
Mm.
how you adapt and what are the nuances between speaking to a company and to a business versus
Yeah.
speaking to individuals.
When you're speaking to individuals or companies, the process generally is the same. It's really about listening with intent and purpose in terms of what it is that they want to achieve, adapting to a certain extent because there are things as organizations that they want to achieve that they may not see necessarily as about inclusive strategy or inclusive purpose or social impact or all of these different sort of frames. However, it's important, I think, for those of us that are working in this area that we keep our focus on what it is that we're trying to change, and continue to look at ways that we bring those organizations with us on that journey. So you can see that, for example, in the way that procurement strategies, public funding, for example, are talking about social value, social impact. Many organizations are signing up to be B corporations, that kind of thing. And in the past, we've had other pledges and different types of assessments and things like that. But the core of them, they've often talked about very similar things. How are people treated in the process? How can we make sure that the environment and the wider community is not left behind or hurt by what it is that you are doing? So yeah, it's not necessarily about starting again or reinventing the wheel, but it is about recognizing that for each organization, their size, their resources, and the way that they want to operate is going to be different. And that's where the kind of nuance, I think, around adaptation comes in.
And so if we now sort of look more broadly at
Mm.
the industry, and if you had, I mean, there's many things I'm sure that you'd love to change, but if you
Yeah.
had to kind of just hook onto one where you're, passionate about it, but you could see that if this thing could change, this is the impact it could have
Mm.
much more broadly than currently.
Yeah. I think it's actually about inclusive practice and management training. So in our industry, we have fantastic people who have done very well, maybe technically, maybe as designers, etc., who will often get promoted to look after people and processes and the technical bits. I run inclusive leadership workshops, and it is astonishing how many people, when I say, has anyone done any management training, any leadership training, anything, hands are down. You'll find 1 in 10 if you are lucky. That's extraordinary. Given the size of projects, the budgets, the numbers of people, etc., 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 we seem to have a thing in our industry where people are put in these positions, and we hope that they'll survive. We hope that it won't go wrong. We just are hoping, and that, I think, is something that would make such a huge difference, and particularly in terms of managing people. I often say that as an industry, what we are, um, really well trained to do is to manage processes. What should happen, when it should happen. Let's forget, that there are people who will be pressing those buttons or staying up and doing those drawings or whatever it is. We just know that these things need to happen in a particular order, but that's not the same thing as leadership. And if that leadership style is an inclusive style, game changer for our industry.
And yeah, I completely agree. But I just want to get into the actual things about why it's a game changer because
Mm,
I see this as well in my leadership work, and really that's the reason I stepped outside of practice was to focus
mm,
in on supporting leaders because I throughout all my career in all of the
mm,
projects that I saw, leadership was the biggest gap that needed filling. And
yes.
there were certain people that stepped in, and most of the people there would describe themselves as somebody who fell into leadership, like
Yeah.
you just described there.
Yeah.
And I've certainly had some token leadership training over the years,
Mm,
but you go into a room and you're there for a couple of days and then you walk out and
mm,
you've got this buzz with you, but it doesn't last very long and you're into the trenches of a project yet
mm.
again.
Mm,
But I'd love to get into, but why is it such a game changer when you can support leaders to be thinking more inclusively, to be
mm,
bringing people with them, to be allowing diverse, quite challenging conversations some days to
mm,
happen, and know that there's a much longer term benefit for the project and for the team and for the organization more broadly?
yeah. I think it's so important, and why it's a game changer is because I think, particularly when we're talking about architecture and the built environment, we are still talking about a collaboration between artisans, thinkers, designers, coordinators, managers. It's such a broad church, for want of a better phrase, of different types of perspectives, skills, etc. 21st century leadership needs to be not only attuned to that, it also needs to be attuned to the fact that it's a multi-generational um, workforce that we're looking at, that we're in our, can never remember if it's the right term, fourth industrial age, fifth industrial age with AI. We are facing things that we've never faced before, with a workforce that we've never seen before, and somehow we're expecting that just dropping people in and using 20th century and even earlier techniques is going to be the right mix to lead us into, the depths of the 21st century. I'm not buying it. I think the risks are high for companies, but also for individuals. So the individuals who are taking all of that on without any kind of guidance, without any kind of training, they're taking that on, they're taking that home, they might be sharing that with their friends and family. Oh, goodness, you won't believe what happened today or last week or whatever it is. I just think that feels intuitively, practically wrong and unsustainable. So, if we're thinking about what we'd like the outcomes to be, what kind of leaders we need, it makes sense to me that we should be having these conversations, but also making sure that there is something that creates that support structure for 21st century leaders. you know, Architects of yore were not dealing with as many things as architectural leaders and managers are now. We have to prepare them. We can't just allow them to kind of step off the cliff and hope they don't break. That's why I would say it's a game changer.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd love your tips on if someone knows they need to have, a let's not call it confronting, but a challenging conversation where they would like to be direct about something that they are seeing that they don't find acceptable
Mm,
within their project, within their team, and they're trying to alert leaders to it
yeah,
because they care,
yeah,
not because they want to be difficult. And I just love your tips on, how to go about having those challenging conversations, but those conversations that honestly don't, there's just not enough of them. But if
yeah.
there was, if people understood there's a respectful way to have
Oh,
these
yeah,
kinds of conversations, I think we'd be in
yeah.
a better place, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, and very specific as well. So in terms of challenging conversations, I mean, the first things first, one of the tips I would give is really pay attention to the culture and the currency of the people that you're trying to influence or change. What matters to them? How would they normally communicate? How do they best take on information? In terms of yourself, do you feel that doing this on your own is best, or do you feel that maybe there might be other people that you might want to bring along into the conversation? How might you have the conversation without it necessarily being just about feelings? So, where's your data that you might want to bring along? And I don't mean you go off and write lots of things and there's lots of
Although
research.
AI could do that
So,
for you
yeah,
to some extent.
it's not that, but more often than not, I think when a leader or manager is hearing something, as in framed as "I am not happy" or "I've seen something," their immediate thing is defense. I am going to shut down. I am now feeling emotional because you brought this to my attention, and I think you're blaming me. So all of that is going on while the other person thinks, oh, they'll love the fact that I'm bringing up something that they could do something about. So if there's a kind of mismatch in terms of the communication style, and there is a kind of agreed common ground that you want to get to, I think that's where it could become quite sort of fractious. But if you are able to bring that kind of, I understand who you are, I understand that this is a conversation that is difficult. However, what I can present to you is a mixture of this perspective, along with some data, and actually we have all noticed this, so it's not just me, that kind of thing. That is, some of the tips that I would give in terms of how you can start to have quite difficult conversations. And I bring up the thing about the individual because lots of people avoid difficult conversations. So if you're thinking, I've seen this thing, but I really don't want to be the person, it's okay. Who else can be part of that kind of group for you, either as a support or that you go, well, why don't three of us? Why don't I copy you in? Why don't we approach together and say, let's have a meeting and talk about this thing? But I know I'm not going to be sitting there kind of terrified into silence or sitting there regretting ever bringing it up or something like that. But understanding the people, I think, is a really important part of it as well. I hope that answers the
It
question.
does, it does. And I also think there's something there about asking questions when you get into that situation.
Mm,
This is what we're seeing from our perspective, but clearly you on the other side are seeing something different. What are we missing? Because I think a lot of the time, especially
mm,
in a practice situation, you don't understand the bigger picture. Potentially you're so caught
absolutely.
up in your own project that you can't see even the project that's happening right alongside you. And
Yeah,
or that the leader that you are working with has 3 or 4 other projects going on and potentially other stresses that you're not aware of. So I just think
absolutely.
there's also a moment to ask questions about, this is what I'm seeing, but I appreciate that you're seeing something different. I'd love to know what I'm missing here and what we can do to try and make this better. And I think it's all about how you frame that you care. That's why you're bringing this up. It's not that you
And
necessarily want to be a problem,
absolutely.
because I think it's an easy out, isn't it? To start identifying someone as, well, he or she is going to be bringing the problems to me always. So whenever we sit down to meet, I'm going to be dreading what problems this person is bringing to me.
Yeah,
And so you don't
absolutely.
want to be that person either. It's a tricky one, isn't it?
It's a tricky one. And, oftentimes, in my experience, I'd often bring it up as, I've seen something, I think I might have an answer. I'd really love your opinion on this. So you're bringing them in terms of there's potentially a solution. I'm not trying to burden you with another thing to do because I know you're super, super busy and I know you've got this list that you never complete. But hey, if I can help you, in fact, if we can help you or help the business or help the organization, it's like it frames it in a completely different way. It's not always possible. And no doubt there will be people listening go, oh, but you haven't met my boss or you haven't met the people that I work with. That will never work. But I think that's why that thing of, really understanding the kind of currency or communication, understanding as far as you can, like you say, the context to a certain extent. You can't know everything. Um, but I think that sense of here is someone who's willing to bring me something, and also they're not, they're bringing something in a sense that we can tackle this together rather than you need to do something and I'm blaming you or something like that. There are difficult conversations where it can be actually um, about an individual leader, but more often than not, people are bringing up things because they want to see their practice, their studio, that business do better. You know, they can see an issue that might be the thing that's driving lower productivity or meaning that people don't want to stay with that business. So these are all things that are incredibly helpful to the business. But if you're hearing it as, oh, here's someone complaining again. Oh no, here's another problem. It's very hard to, get past that and see what they're actually trying to do is to address something that is actually going to help the business.
And if I had to ask you what feels, I mean, everyone normally goes, "Oh, I don't really have those moments," but a moment where you had to be courageous, you had to really go out of
Mm,
your comfort zone,
mm.
what comes to mind for you?
Oh goodness. Out of your comfort zone. Well, many people, when I tell them that I'm an introvert, they go, Are you sure? I don't think so. But I am. I truly am. So I speak a lot. And I remember the first times, in crits and then in the office where I had to do presentations, and I'd be shaking the whole way through, and I'd be reading what it is that I'm going to say. And I think more often than not, it's moments like that. But I'll stop speaking and people say, "You seem so calm." But it's something because I do it over and over and over again to try and challenge that discomfort. Um, is the thing. And maybe it doesn't sound like a very big thing. Maybe it sounds like quite a small thing. It is, I would say, an essential kind of skill for many people who are in the business of basically communication or using their voice or challenging or something like that. But it doesn't come naturally. But I'd like to let everyone know that it didn't come naturally to me either. Because we'd be like, oh, yeah, you do this. Oh, you seem like you do this all the time. But yeah, it is something genuinely um, that is still a challenge for sure. And I
But at the
think
same
it's
time, you decided to work on it and to practice it and to kind of lean into that discomfort as you're describing there.
Yeah, but I think it's also because there is a bigger picture. If there wasn't this thing that I want to be just one of the many parts of, in terms of making change, then I'd be quite happy at home reading my book. There's no desire for me to just be out there speaking, if there was no reason to. Um, so yeah, it's something that I felt that, the discomfort is partly that you go, oh, I have to do this. You know, who else is going to do it?
Well,
It's
exactly. It's like, who else is going to do it? And if I do it and I do it in a way that's not so perfect, then maybe someone else will think, well, hey, I could do that too. Well, look what she
absolutely.
did. I can do this too.
Yeah, can I support other people doing it as well? Because, there are so many other people who are thinking similar things, but they may not be the person that, steps in front of the mic or stands up on stage or sets up something. Um, but yeah, I have had that said to me actually. Someone said, "Oh gosh, the fact that you're doing it makes me feel like it's possible." And yes, this is what we need. Um, because I think there are styles, going back to the sort of leadership piece. People have this assumption that to be a leader, you must be a very particular personality type. I would disagree. I think there are lots of leaders who, span the range of styles and types. We respond to the ones perhaps that maybe mirror ourselves or are almost the exact opposite, because you think, oh my gosh, I could never be that person. I could never be the person that stands up and says that thing. But that's all okay. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that you can focus on? How can you leverage both um, yourself and the people around you to make something kind of happen? Doesn't necessarily all have to be on you, and you certainly don't have to mimic someone else's communication or leadership style to do that.
Definitely not. And also, when you've found some of that personal drive,
Mm.
that means that you'll go above and beyond and you'll step out and you'll speak up when you need to, and you'll support someone else who is doing something that you know is brave, that you know how much courage it takes, and you're more likely to then go and support them because you know what that feeling is like. And that actually a lot of the time I think we just need to see someone ahead of us and
Mm.
be able to see something of ourselves in them, or react to it in such a way that, well, I must do it. Now that I've seen that,
Yeah.
I do need to step up because there is a better way. It can be a positive and a negative reaction, I suppose, that,
Mm.
going back to your very early career,
Mm.
you had a negative reaction, which, drove you to do the things you're doing now.
Mm.
And I think you can either you can be negative about something, or you can say, I'm going to take control and I'm going to make some decisions that make things easier for the next person coming.
Yeah, I'm a really big believer in that. And I think that's why mentoring really spoke to me as one of our kind of core things, that no matter what your experience has been, you have something to share, you have a perspective. I love when I'm interviewing prospective mentors, and they say, I put myself forward, but I really don't think I've got anything to say or share, or what do I know, kind of thing. And they're really, really worried about getting it right. And they often make the best mentors because they have that kind of sense of the responsibility. But also there's a kind of a humility. I don't know it all. I'm not turning up here to say I'm great, and if you just do what I do, you're going to be great too. It is not that. And I think that if there is any way in which you can support someone, or be there for someone, and it doesn't really matter about the level either. I think you can have huge amounts of empathy for leaders as well as for people who are navigating really difficult the starts of their careers. But once that's in place, where people can get to is just extraordinary. I can remember when I first started one of the mentoring projects, I thought, oh, we'll probably do this for a year, 2 years, see how it goes. 12, 15 years later, I'm still getting emails who say, oh, can we get another project? Can we do something? The reason that we've kept doing it is because we see that transformation. And that transformation is just awesome. It's absolutely awesome. I can remember we had someone who applied and we said, we're going to have this event. And they messaged me saying they were too scared to come in the door to attend the event. And then I said, oh my goodness, where are you? And I kind of got them and they stood next to me and they were too nervous to speak to anybody. And now this person is an advocate. They work with other organizations advocating around mental health. And I'm like, I cannot believe that this is the same person. Now, I don't take, we have these wonderful mentors, these wonderful volunteers. We just provide the platform for amazing people to do amazing things. That's what it is. But to see those changes, it's wonderful.
I love the way you describe that, a platform for people, for amazing people to do amazing things. I mean, honestly, that's the business. That's the model.
Yeah,
I love it.
yeah. Thank you.
Is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you are so keen, like you'd love a listener to understand about what you do and what you've seen?
Oh, that's a really big question. I think there's something that kind of comes back to us sometimes. Particularly when we're going into people's businesses and we're talking about things that many people have been thinking, but they've been too nervous to say it, or they're not quite sure how to bring it up. And it's that sense of I suddenly felt seen or I suddenly felt heard. And I think if people take away that there is a sense that, or there is an organization that is there for them in that way, that would make me incredibly happy. But also that people listening who are thinking, yeah, I think we need to do some things to make changes, but we're not quite sure where to start. There is an organization that might be able to help us with that. So I think, facilitating people to do amazing things, but also making those connections, I think, between, those really difficult and hard feelings, but then getting to a place where you can confront, challenge, and make tangible change. That's really what we're about. So that's the thing I would love people to take away from what we do, what we try to do.
Brilliant. What an amazing conversation. Oh,
I'm
honestly. And I hope that we do get to meet in person at some
sure
stage
we will.
soon.
I'm sure we will. And best of luck with all of this. As I said at the beginning, just hearing the title, I was like, oh, I'm intrigued. I want to know more. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for including me and inviting me to take part in this conversation, and for all the very kind things that you said. Very best of luck.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by the Courageous Leaders app. This app is designed to get you to lead with clarity, be highly valued, and build your impact. It's for leaders who've outgrown the way things have always been done, for next-gen leaders who know that there is a more effective, more courageous way to lead. And they just need a framework, and they need the tools and the tips and the strategies from somebody who has been through it and somebody who has researched leaders who have done big, bold, courageous things. And why is this different? This gives you tangible tools and strategies that you can apply immediately, no matter what stage of the project you are on or what sector, what scale. It feels as though you've got an expert leader in your corner, and you can make this fit your schedule. I've had very busy leaders go through my program and they're amazed that they had time to do it, and the actions and the things that changed around them as a result. So I can't wait for you to check it out for yourself.